She closes the door, looks at her reflection, and smiles. Not because she's happy, but because she's learned how to disappear with elegance. The mirror shows her what she's become, a woman who has mastered the art of being less than herself, believing this diminishment is love's entrance fee. There's a moment right before she enters any relationship where she performs an ancient ritual. She doesn't realize she's doing it. She takes the fullness of who she is, her opinions, her needs, her wild dreams, her inconvenient truths, and she folds them away like delicate clothes too precious to wear. She tells herself she's being considerate. She tells herself she's being wise. She tells herself she's being loved. But what she's actually doing is committing the first betrayal, the one that makes all others possible. At age 6, she learned that being quiet earned safety, that silence bought her affection. When she laughed too loudly, the room went cold. When she spoke her truth, faces turned away. When she took up space, she was reminded that good girls make themselves small. So she learned to edit herself before anyone else could reject her. She learned to leave herself before anyone else could abandon her. This is where the pattern begins. Not with the men who will disappoint her, not with the relationships that will drain her. It begins with a little girl who discovers that love feels safer when she's not entirely present for it. Every time she loves, she loses herself. Not because of him, but because of an ancient wound that whispers, "Don't be too much. Don't be too bright. Don't be too demanding. Don't be too real." This wound speaks in her mother's voice, her father's silence, her teacher's corrections, her first love's indifference. It speaks in the language of every woman who learned to shrink before her, creating a generational echo of self-betrayal. She doesn't choose men who betray her, she chooses them after betraying herself. The betrayal is already complete by the time she says, "I love you." Because what she's really saying is, "I love you enough to not be me." And what he hears is permission to accept less than her fullness, to meet her fiction instead of her truth.
Learned to love like a master counterfeiter, creating beautiful replicas of herself that are missing the essential element, her soul. And like any counterfeit, these relationships feel almost real until you look closely and realize something vital is missing. The tragedy isn't that she's been betrayed by others. The tragedy is that she's been betraying herself for so long, she's forgotten it's not love's natural price. She's forgotten that disappearing isn't the same as being chosen. She's forgotten that earning someone's attention by being less than herself is not the same as being loved. There's a room in her heart she's never let anyone enter. Not because it's forbidden, but because she's forgotten it exists. It's the room where her unedited thoughts live, where her unnamed dreams gather dust, where her authentic laugh echoes against walls that have known only silence. It's the room where the woman she was, before she learned to trade herself for love, still waits, still hopes, still believes in a different kind of relationship. She walks through the world like a woman carrying a suitcase full of herself, but only unpacking the clothes she thinks others want to see. The rest remains folded, unworn, waiting for a safety that never comes. Because as long as she's performing being lovable instead of being loved, she's trapped in a theater where she's both the actress and the audience, critiquing her own performance while forgetting that love isn't meant to be a performance at all. The mirror reflection that smiles back at her isn't lying. It's grieving. It's the face of a woman who has become so skilled at being what others need that she's lost touch with what she needs. It's the face of someone who has confused being chosen for being seen, being wanted for being known, being needed for being loved. She thinks she's protecting love by making herself smaller, but she's actually starving it. Love needs truth to survive. It needs the full spectrum of who you are, the light and the shadow, the easy and the difficult, the convenient and the inconvenient. When she edits herself for love, she's not giving love a chance to prove itself. She's giving it a sanitized version and wondering why it feels empty. The first betrayal happens in the mirror, in the quiet moment before she meets someone new. It happens when she decides who she'll be, instead of trusting who she is. It happens when she chooses to be chosen over being authentic, when she values being wanted over being honest, when she confuses accommodation with love. And this betrayal, this original wound, becomes the template for every relationship that follows, because you cannot receive love for who you are when you've never offered who you are. You cannot be fully known when you've never been fully revealed. You cannot be authentically chosen when you've never been authentically present. She closes the door, looks at her reflection, and smiles. But somewhere behind that smile, the woman
she abandoned is still waiting, still hoping, still believing that love might be possible without the betrayal, still dreaming of a relationship where she can be fully herself and still be fully loved. The question isn't whether she'll love again. The question is whether she'll learn to love without leaving herself behind. Whether she'll discover that the very parts of herself she's been hiding are the parts that make love possible. Whether she'll realize that the price of being loved shouldn't be the cost of being herself. Because until she learns to stay present for love, she'll keep experiencing the echo of that first betrayal in every relationship that follows. She'll keep wondering why love feels so empty when she's worked so hard to be lovable. She'll keep believing that being less than herself is the price of admission to love's possibility. But what if it's not? What if the very act of showing up fully, with all her inconvenient truths, her complicated needs, her brilliant mind, her wild heart, is not love's obstacle, but its invitation? What if the woman she's been hiding is exactly the woman love has been waiting to meet? The door closes, the reflection smiles, and somewhere in the space between who she is and who she thinks she should be, a different kind of love story waits to begin. She sits in her garden, tending to roses that have learned to bloom without thorns. She has spent years training them, cutting away their natural defenses, believing that beauty requires the removal of anything that might cause discomfort. As she touches their stems, soft and vulnerable, she doesn't realize she's looking at a mirror of her own transformation. A woman who has learned to love by removing the very parts of herself that were designed to protect her truth. The betrayal isn't a single act. It's a symphony of small surrenders, each one seeming reasonable, each one feeling like love. She doesn't wake up one morning and decide to abandon herself. She does it gradually, methodically, the way water shapes stone, drop by drop, until the original form is unrecognizable. There are 5 ways she performs this disappearing act, 5 rituals of self-abandonment that she's learned to call love. Each one carries the DNA of that first betrayal, each one a different verse in the same song of making herself smaller to fit into someone else's vision of who she should be. The first way she betrays herself is the most insidious because it feels like kindness. She silences her truth to be liked. Watch her in conversation, how she takes her authentic thoughts and runs them through an internal filter before they reach her lips. She doesn't lie. She's too honest for that. But she edits. She softens. She removes the edges that might create friction, the opinions that might create distance, the boundaries that might create conflict. Like a rose that has learned to grow without thorns, she has trained herself to exist without the natural defenses that were to protect her truth.
protect her authentic self. When someone asks her opinion, she doesn't give it. She gives the version she thinks they want to hear.
When someone crosses her boundaries, she doesn't enforce them. She questions whether she has the right to have them at all. She calls this being considerate. She calls this being mature. She calls this being loved. But what she's actually doing is slowly starving her relationships of the very thing that makes them real, her unfiltered truth. She's creating connections based on who she thinks she should be, rather than who she is, and then wondering why these relationships feel hollow, why they feel like beautiful shells with nothing living inside them. The queen within her, the one who was born knowing her worth, who came into this world with opinions and preferences and a voice that was meant to be heard, sits silenced on a throne she's convinced herself she doesn't deserve. She's learned to whisper when she was born to speak, to suggest when she was born to declare, to apologize for taking up space when she was designed to fill it with her presence. Every time she bites her tongue to keep the peace, she's not preserving love. She's preserving the illusion of love. She's creating a relationship with her shadow, with the acceptable version of herself, while her authentic self grows more distant, more foreign, more forgotten. The second way she betrays herself is through the ancient confusion of caretaking with love. She mothers him instead of meeting him as an equal. Watch her transform in his presence, how she becomes a different creature entirely, one whose primary function is to tend to his emotional wounds, to anticipate his needs, to manage his moods like a weather system she's responsible for predicting and controlling. Every time she wipes his emotional wounds, she bleeds invisibly. She becomes a nurse to his pain while her own pain goes unattended. She learns his emotional language fluently while forgetting how to speak her own. She becomes an expert in his needs while her own needs become foreign territory, unexplored and unacknowledged. This isn't love. It's the confusion of worth with usefulness. She's not loving him, she's trying to earn love through service, through the exhausting labor of being indispensable. She's operating from the belief that if she can just be needed enough, she'll be chosen. If she can just be helpful enough, she'll be valued. If she can just be nurturing enough, she'll be loved. But relationships built on caretaking create patience, not partners. They create dependence, not connection. They create obligation, not affection. She becomes so busy being his emotional mother that she forgets to be his equal, so busy managing his inner world that she loses track of her own. The internal mother within her, the one who is meant to nurture her own growth, her own dreams, her own healing, has been conscripted into service for someone else's emotional development,
Giving away the very energy that was meant to tend to her own garden, and then wondering why she feels empty, why she feels depleted, why she feels like she's disappearing. The third way she betrays herself is perhaps the most dangerous because it masquerades as passion. She calls anxiety chemistry and chaos passion. She has learned to mistake the adrenaline of uncertainty for the electricity of connection, the stress of instability for the excitement of romance, the fear of abandonment for the intensity of love. You don't want love. You want adrenaline disguised as attention. You've become addicted to the high of uncertainty, the rush of wondering if you're chosen, the drama of earning someone's affection through the sheer force of your anxiety. You've confused the cortisol flooding your system with the oxytocin of genuine connection. She finds herself drawn to relationships that keep her slightly off balance, slightly unsure, slightly in pursuit. She mistakes the sick feeling in her stomach for butterflies, the sleepless nights for passion, the constant need for reassurance for intimacy. She's learned to associate love with the feeling of almost losing it, with the constant work of proving her worthiness, with the exhausting dance of pursuit and withdrawal. This is her unconscious mind playing out the same pattern it learned in childhood, that love is something precarious, something that must be earned, something that exists in the space between having and losing. She's recreating the familiar territory of uncertainty because uncertainty feels like home, even when home is a place where she never fully belongs. She calls this passion, but passion is not anxiety. She calls this chemistry, but chemistry is not chaos. She calls this love, but love is not the constant fear of its absence. Real love doesn't require her to live in a state of perpetual alertness, constantly monitoring the relationship's pulse, constantly adjusting her behavior to maintain someone's interest. The fourth way she betrays herself is through the exhausting performance of worthiness. She thinks love is something she must deserve by being less inconvenient. She has turned herself into a living audition, constantly performing for the role of being chosen, constantly proving that she's worth the investment of someone's attention. She's dressed herself in the skin of a reduced version of herself, wearing her smallness like a costume designed to make others comfortable. She's learned to make herself convenient, emotionally, physically, intellectually. She doesn't ask for too much. She doesn't need too much. She doesn't take up too much space. She's become a human accommodation, a woman-shaped apology for her own existence. This performance of worthiness is exhausting because it requires her to constantly monitor herself, to constantly adjust her natural impulses, to constantly choose the version of herself that's most palatable to others. She's not being loved, she's being tolerated for her ability to remain unobtrusive. She thinks she's being considerate, but she's actually being dishonest. She's presenting a version of herself that doesn't exist, the version that never has bad days, never has complicated needs, never has inconvenient emotions. She's created a fictional character and then wondering why her relationships feel like elaborate performances rather than genuine connections. The woman she was born to be, the one with preferences and boundaries and needs and desires, has been relegated to the shadows, while this more convenient version takes center stage. She sacrificed her authenticity for acceptability, her truth for tolerance, her fullness for the illusion of being low maintenance. The fifth and most heartbreaking way she betrays herself is through the preemptive abandonment of her own essence. She leaves herself before he does. She abandons her core self so he'll have fewer reasons to leave, not understanding that in doing so, she's given him nothing authentic to stay for. She performs this self-abandonment like a protective ritual, believing that she can just become small enough, agreeable enough, undemanding enough, she can prevent the inevitable disappointment. She's trying to control the uncontrollable, another person's capacity for love, by making herself smaller, more manageable, more easily discarded. But here's the cruel irony. The very thing she's doing to prevent abandonment is what makes abandonment inevitable. When she leaves herself, she's not giving him a chance to love her. She's giving him a chance to love her representative, her stand-in, her emotional body double. And when he inevitably grows tired of this performance, when he senses the inauthenticity beneath the accommodation, he doesn't leave her. He leaves the fiction she's created. She doesn't realize that by abandoning herself first, she's training everyone around her to do the same. She's teaching them that she's not worth staying for, that her authentic self is too much trouble, that her real needs are too inconvenient. She's creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where her deepest fear, being left, becomes inevitable because she's left herself first. Each of these betrayals feeds the others. The silencing of her truth makes her more likely to caretake. The caretaking makes her more likely to mistake anxiety for passion. The anxiety makes her more likely to perform worthiness. The performance makes her more likely to abandon herself, and the abandonment makes her more likely to silence her truth. It's a cycle that perpetuates itself, each betrayal making the next one feel more necessary, more justified, more like love. She doesn't see the pattern because she's living inside it. She doesn't recognize the betrayal because she's been performing it for so long it feels like breathing. She doesn't understand that these aren't the inevitable compromises of love. They're the symptoms of a woman who has forgotten that love is supposed to include her, not replace her. The garden around her is full of roses without thorns, beautiful and defenseless, vulnerable to every passing threat. She tends to them with the same care she tends to her relationships, removing anything that might cause discomfort, anything that might create conflict, anything that might require others to be careful with her. But as she touches their soft stems, she doesn't realize that thorns aren't obstacles to love. They're protection for it. They're the boundary that says, handle with care. They're the truth that says, I am worth your attention, your respect, your careful consideration. They're the authentic self that refuses to be diminished for the sake of being plucked. The woman she was born to be is still there, beneath the layers of accommodation and performance and preemptive abandonment. She's still there, waiting for permission to exist again, to speak again, to take up space again. She's still there, hoping that someday love will feel like coming home to herself rather than leaving herself behind. She stands before a broken mirror, but something has changed. For the first time in years, she's not trying to fix her reflection. She's trying to see through the cracks to the woman who was always there, waiting beneath the performance. The fragments don't show her a shattered woman, they show her a woman who was never actually broken, only hidden behind layers of accommodation and fear. The mirror has been cracked for so long she forgot it was ever whole. But now, in the spaces between the fractures, she glimpses something she thought she'd lost forever, the face of a woman who doesn't need to disappear to be loved. The face of a woman who was worthy before she learned to earn worthiness, who was complete before she learned to perform completeness, who was lovable before she learned to manufacture love through self-abandonment. You don't need to become better to be loved. You need to remember the parts of you that were taught to go silent. You need to call them back from the exile you sent them to, the places where you hid your inconvenient truths, your complicated needs, your authentic responses to the world around you. There's a room in your heart that you locked away so long ago you forgot you had the key. It's not a room of shame or shadow. It's a room of power. It's where your unedited thoughts live, where your unnamed dreams gather strength, where your authentic voice has been practicing for its return. It's the room where the woman you were before you learned to trade yourself for love has been waiting, not with judgment, but with open arms. The key to this room was never lost. It was never taken from you. You simply convinced yourself you didn't have the right to use it. You convinced yourself that access to your own authenticity was a privilege you had to earn through good behavior, through being easy to love, through being convenient to keep.
But authenticity isn't a privilege. It's your birthright. It's not something you earn through suffering or sacrifice or self-abandonment. It's something you were born with, something that belongs to you as surely as your heartbeat, something that no relationship should ever ask you to surrender. Look at the woman in the mirror again. See how she's been trying to hold herself together with the approval of others? How she's been using someone else's love as the glue for her own self-worth. But you are not a broken thing that needs external validation to remain whole. You are not a puzzle missing pieces that only the right person can provide. You are complete, right now, in this moment, with all your complications and contradictions and inconvenient truths. The love you've been seeking, the love that makes you feel seen, understood, chosen, begins with the love you give yourself. Not the conditional love that depends on being perfect, being easy, being convenient. The unconditional love that says you are worthy of care exactly as you are, with all your needs and boundaries and authentic responses to the world. This is not about becoming someone new. This is about remembering who you always were. This is about archaeological work,
digging through the layers of who you thought you had to be to uncover the woman who was buried beneath years of accommodation and performance. She sits on a throne that was never empty, only occupied by the wrong person. For years, she's been letting others sit in the seat of her own self-worth, giving them the power to determine her value, to decide if she's worthy of love, to choose whether she deserves to be chosen. But that throne belongs to her. It always has. It always will. The crown she's been seeking from others, the validation, the acceptance, the love, has been hidden under her own bed all along. Not because she wasn't worthy of wearing it, but because she forgot it was hers to claim. She's been begging for a crown while sitting on her own throne, asking for permission to be herself while holding the key to her own authenticity. True love doesn't ask you to audition for it. It doesn't require you to prove your worthiness through self-diminishment. It doesn't demand that you become smaller to fit into its vision of who you should be. True love meets you where you are, with all your complexity, and says, yes, this is what I've been waiting for. The relationships that required you to betray yourself were never about love. They were about control. They were about someone else's comfort being more important than your authenticity. They were about someone else's fear of your fullness being more important than your right to exist fully. But you are not responsible for managing other people's discomfort with your authenticity. You are not responsible for making yourself smaller so others can feel bigger. You are not responsible for editing your truth so others can avoid facing theirs. When you stop operating from a place of desperation and start operating from a place of self-love, your relationships will change reflectively.
When you stop betraying yourself, you stop attracting people who expect you to. When you stop abandoning yourself, you stop attracting people who are comfortable with your absence. When you stop performing worthiness, you stop attracting people who want a performance instead of a person. The woman who shows up fully, with her boundaries intact, her voice unleashed, her needs acknowledged, doesn't attract everyone, but she attracts the right person. She attracts someone who isn't threatened by her fullness, someone who isn't overwhelmed by her authenticity, someone who doesn't need her to be less than herself to feel comfortable being more than himself. This is the love that's been waiting for you, not the love that requires you to disappear, but the love that invites you to appear. Not the love that demands you become someone else, but the love that celebrates who you've always been. Not the love that asks you to silence your truth, but the love that wants to hear every word you've been afraid to speak. The transformation isn't about learning to love differently. It's about learning to love from a place of fullness instead of emptiness, from a place of choice instead of desperation, from a place of authenticity instead of performance. You don't need to betray yourself to be chosen. You need to choose yourself first. You need to occupy your own throne, wear your own crown, unlock your own rooms. You need to remember that you are not a rough draft of a woman waiting to be edited into acceptability. You are the final version, complete and whole and worthy of love exactly as you are. The mirror pieces begin to rearrange themselves, not into the old reflection that smiled to hide its emptiness, but into something new. A woman who smiles because she's finally home in her own skin. A woman who doesn't need to disappear to be loved because she's learned the secret that eluded her for so long. The right love doesn't ask you to vanish, it asks you to shine. Every time you've betrayed yourself for love, you've been giving someone else the power to determine your worth. Every time you've abandoned yourself to be chosen, you've been teaching others that you're not worth staying for. Every time you've performed being lovable instead of being yourself, you've been creating relationships with your shadow instead of your soul. But now you know. Now you see. Now you understand that love isn't something you earn through self-abandonment. It's something you receive through self-acceptance. It's not something you win through performance. It's something you attract through authenticity.
It's not something you manufacture through accommodation. It's something you create through the courage to be fully, completely, unapologetically yourself. The woman in the mirror no longer needs to smile to hide her emptiness because she's no longer empty. She's no longer performing being lovable because she's no longer afraid of being unlovable. She's no longer betraying herself because she's finally learned the truth that will set her free. She was never meant to be loved in pieces. She was meant to be loved whole. Stand up from the throne of self-abandonment. Walk away from the mirror of performance. Open the door to the room where your authentic self has been waiting. You don't need to betray yourself to be chosen. You need to choose yourself fully and finally, and trust that the love meant for you will recognize you when you're brave enough to be seen. You don't need to disappear to be loved. You need to appear fully, finally, authentically. You need to show up as the woman you've always been beneath the layers of who you thought you had to be. You need to trust that your fullness is not too much for the right person, that your authenticity is not too complicated for real love, that your truth is not too inconvenient for someone who's meant to stay. The betrayal ends here. The performance ends here. The self-abandonment ends here. What begins is something you've never experienced before. Love that includes you. Love that celebrates you. Love that chooses you not despite who you are, but because of who you are. If this story has echoed in your heart, if you've seen yourself in the mirror of these words, comment below, "I will never betray myself for love again." Share this with a sister who thinks making herself smaller is proof of love. Because the woman who learns to love without leaving herself behind doesn't just transform her own life. She transforms the lives of every woman who sees her courage and remembers her own. The mirror is whole again. The woman is whole again. The love is whole again. And it all begins with the choice to never again betray the woman you were born to be.